already, and he clipped off, before it started budding out, he clipped off new growth from last year. So this is new growth. You can see this is how much it grew last year. So pretty good year of growth. And so these are the sections he cut. When you're going to propagate apple trees, you want to use last year's growth, just 1 year growth. It could technically take, if you did 2-year-old wood, it's just a lot more difficult, and it doesn't take as readily. So as you can tell, this tree is waking up. As I said, this is the parent tree to all the trees that we're going to be grafting today. This is a black Oxford. It was discovered in Oxford County in Paris, Maine, 1700s. So quite a story with this tree. It makes like a really neat like tie-dye black and purple fruit that lasts like throughout the whole winter. And it kind of gets a little softer as it goes. It can start out pretty hard, but hey, it's good for your teeth. And it's a really great fruit. I especially love the look of the apple. It's one benefit of really hardy winter apples like that for home growing is they actually have thicker skin, which there's no real pest complete resistance on trees unless you spray chemicals, or there are organic means you can do. Clay is a good one for kind of getting more classic looking apples. But the benefit, if you don't use any spray at all, of growing winter apples such as Northern Spy or Black Oxford is that that thick skin does help in some regards keeping some of the pests at bay. It's not going to do 100%, but at least you'll get more apples that look, you know, like you could serve them at your table. And the other organic spray that we use to kind of control pests at times is neem oil, which also helps with the vitality of the tree. It has omega fatty acids that actually really give a nice shine to the leaves. The clay is just clay, kaolin clay, K-A-L-I-N, and that you have to keep reapplying after rains. There's a couple times a year where you would want to cover your tree, especially as they're little fruitlets, and that helps prevent some of the pests from really affecting the fruit. So those are two sprays if you were interested in pursuing that route at some point. But we typically don't spray anything on a lot of these trees, and the nice thing about the Black Oxford is it has some resistance. So this is a standard tree. So we planted this, I want to say 7 or 8 years ago, and it was just a little guy. So it hasn't, since it's a standard tree, it hasn't really borne much fruit, but it will over time. And it's going to outlive us, which is neat, you know, as long as nobody drives a tractor over it or anything.
Mower injury is a great way to lose trees. Don't get too close with the mowers, people.
Yeah.
I've lost a lot of trees that way.
And on the note of preserving trees, are we going to talk about this in a little bit?
Yeah.
Okay. So there's just some minimal things you can do to make sure your trees survive the first several years, which are really important time. So we kind of missed the window for winter pruning. So as you can tell, this tree is starting to wake up, and it's not really an ideal time for pruning now as the tree is waking up. There is summer pruning that you can do, and that we'll probably do on this tree to control the size of it. And I like to do that after it kind of branches out and flowers out. Maybe July, August is actually another time you can do some light pruning to get the shape. So this, we've started to kind of get some shape of the tree. We're doing a central leader. It was the idea, but actually this tree kind of wanted to express itself in its own way. So apple trees, a lot of times what you want to do is scaffolding with a central leader. So you would start about 4 feet up off the ground. You would have layers of branches, probably 4 or 5. And then you'd have another break that goes like 3 or 4 feet. And then you'd have another scaffold of another 4 branches and so on. And then you choose one leader that's going to kind of be the central source of your scaffolds. So it kind of looks like a Christmas tree or that sort of shape once you're growing up, and that gives plenty of airspace, and it allows the fruit to get good pollination and good sunlight. So this tree, sometimes it's good to just let a tree do what it wants with a minimal intervention, and that's what we've done here. Yeah, question?
Yeah, question. You said 4 feet. Is that a good idea for the lowest branch?
Yes.
Okay, so that's like 2 feet maybe.
Yeah, I guess if you call this the lowest branch, yeah. But I'm thinking like about here, okay. This is a good scaffold. I mean, in reality, if we were really trying to do central leader, we probably would have taken this off. But, you know, at this point, you never want to remove more than 1/3 of the tree at any given time. And the more you remove, the more the tree is going to bounce back. So you may actually think you're controlling the tree a lot by cutting it a lot, but actually what you're going to do if you cut it too much is you're going to create a lot of new growth and a lot of sporadic growth because the tree's worried that it's just fighting for life. But yeah, to your point about first branch, technically if we were really going for central leader, we probably should have started here, which is like 3 feet up. And if we were going central leader, I would have chose this one probably as the central leader, and you can prune it so that it kind of stays more central. I would take out some of this competition for leadership, and anytime you're pruning, you want to do right on the collar, so just right on this outer edge, so that it can heal back over. And
what kind of shears would you recommend, Richard? Would you recommend a bypass shear for those cuts, or?
Yeah, bypass pruners, like Felco's. Also, my favorite thing is just the fold-out Japanese saws. Those are the best for a lot of things. And really sharp, effective cutting. It cuts on the pull. And actually, a lot of times I like to start with the saw and then start thinking about pruning shears because you don't want to, it's better to make bigger cuts first and then really get a vision of what you're doing. Sometimes I can look at a tree for, you know, a good little while before actually cutting anything, and that actually saves time down the stretch because you're not spending so much time just going in and out of there. You can really do a lot of what it needs. So if I was pruning this tree right now, again, we did not remove this early on, so now that's actually taking up a good bit of the tree. This tree is actually kind of starting to be more open center, which is another pruning practice that you typically would use on peaches, and we'll take a look at our peaches up on the hillside. But the prunus, so any peach, plum, pluot, anything in that family, nectarines, all that wants kind of a more open vase formation when you're pruning it. So again, what you're looking is airflow. You're looking for sunlight to get into all parts of the tree. So open vase is really good for that. This one we will eventually bring back to a more central leader because this is going to be a very big tree. So we'll just have to see how that goes. I mean, eventually what I would do is really choose this as the central leader, and then I would start kind of controlling the competition and opening up some airspace by removing some of these branches with a saw. With a saw, what I would do is I'd cut underneath a little bit first and then cut over. That way it doesn't, so if I was cutting this whole branch off, I would do like cut in 1/4 of the way underneath with the saw and then come down, and that way you don't tear the tree as it goes, and you can get a nice clean cut that way. And the collar is considered right where the junction is, so you want to just leave a tiny bit, but you don't want to leave a big stump because that's room for pathogens to get into the tree. So this again is our parent tree. Looks like we've got a lot of fruiting buds this year, so we may actually have fruit this year. One other thing is, if you are cutting for apples, if you cut into 1-year wood, like I was showing you, like this was all grown last year, if you actually cut into that, that's actually going to promote more growth for apples. So if I wanted that central leader tip to grow a little bit more, I would cut it a few buds down to actually spur more growth up there. But if you cut in apples, if you cut into 2-year-old wood, you're actually kind of slowing the growth. It's not going to grow as readily. So that's something really good to consider if you're controlling the size. The benefit of summer pruning is it's a little bit more obvious what you're doing because there's less time for the tree to grow back. But again, you want to be very light. In the summer, I would say less than removing 1/4 branches at any time. I mean, and sometimes what we could do is just remove this whole branch, this whole area, and call it good. And in fact, that might be something we consider because we haven't always gotten to this every year. But Tom, as I said, did come through while the tree was dormant, and you want to do it in the winter time. And so the scion, the wood that we're going to propagate, has been in a refrigerator in plastic bags for over a month now when the tree was dormant. So that's what we're going to be working with today. Yep.
With any kind of dampness, or when you store the scion wood?
Yeah, you can do like a very lightly moist paper towel in there. Don't always have to do that. You don't want it like sopping, so it's not always a necessity. The big thing is like double bagged, so you're not letting it dry out. Yeah.
And the scion wood will kind of like respire a little bit, so once you get it kind of sealed up into that bag, it'll sweat a little bit. And I checked on mine every couple of weeks, and it was staying moist, but you know, not being soaked or damp or dry.
So when you make a big pruning cut,
Yep.
do you put anything on the wound?
No. So we are going to put something on our graft, on the very top of the graft, and actually that's why I've got little Dixie cups so I can break up this big goopy bottle of tree coat. But no, I don't recommend that. It will heal over. Again, you know, the more I talk about this, the more I'm getting serious about cutting this thing off.
That's what sparked it when I thought of that, you know.
But yeah, so I would cut underneath here. I'd cut at least 1/4 of the way through right here, and then I'd come in. It's hard to get in there without kind of scratching this trunk, but you can do it. Just take time to do it. And then if you do that, you're going to be, technically the cambium should be able to heal over. And the stuff with the tree coat is it might prevent some of that healing to happen over.
My uncle, that was a horticulturist,
Yeah.
used to cut higher up, like 3 inches up, and then go back and make the
That's a
cut.
good way too to
Because
take
that
off.
way you don't hurt the main, what you want to keep.
Absolutely. So on bigger prunes, you can remove higher up so that you're not having so much weight come down on it, which could cause tearing.
Or to score the bark.
Yeah,
You don't.
exactly. So yeah, if you weren't cutting into this far enough, or if it was enough weight, it could technically tear some of the bark down here, which is not what you want. So yeah, on larger prunes, you can do one bigger section and then get it just how you want it. Yep.
I have 2 questions. If you were going to spray neem oil,
Yep.
would you start that now that you're just getting buds? And second question is, what do you feed a tree?
Great question. So yeah, you could start neem oil now, and it would prevent things from getting on there early as the caterpillars start coming out. It's kind of a deterrent more than like a pesticide or anything. And it would probably help give some nutrients to these buds as well. And sometimes we'll mix neem oil with like fish emulsion or other things to give a little extra oomph to your question about that. We don't really feed the trees much. We're just trying to build a really good soil structure. So when we planted this tree, we actually planted it with lobster compost from Costa Maine. And that really gave it a boost. So you don't want to give too much nutrients because that can actually burn the roots. So like if you were to do, say, chicken manure or something like that mixed in, that it would probably burn the roots and it'd be counterproductive. So you want kind of light treatment. So the compost mixed in with the soil is actually really great. So you want, when we dug the hole, again, this was just a smaller tree. It was a bare root tree, so it was dormant, no leaves on it. And when we dug out the hole, we mixed the soil that was here, and we have pretty clay-ish soil here, which is good in some ways. We'll see up on the hill some ways where it can retain water too much, and sometimes trees don't like that. This area has enough drainage that the clay, especially mixed with the compost, it's really well rooted now. So I have a lot of faith in this tree as long as the tractors, stay at bay. So to your question, one thing that we also do continuously is we'll mulch the tree with more compost. So what I would recommend doing, and what we've done actually here multiple years, is we've laid down cardboard around the tree, and then we put compost on top of that, like a couple inches thick, and then mulch on top of that. And that creates a nice sandwich, and what it does is it brings some of the nutrient and the life up through the soil, and it keeps building your soil. So that's kind of, instead of like feeding it, say, nutrients, I would say the slow feed technique with compost and building soil that way.
We put Milorganite around because it really deters the deer from coming close. But that's a pretty high nitrogen.
Okay.
Is that going to damage the tree?
It might cause a lot of root growth up near the surface, which could eventually not be a great thing. Okay. But I don't think it would be. What is it again?
Milorganite.
Okay.
Right? Am I saying it right?
Yeah.
Okay.
I think that it probably won't be that detrimental.
Okay. It seems to really keep the deer away, especially our lilacs.
Okay, that's great. The other thing about building your soil slowly over time is you'll build the ecology in the soil. So another package, it's actually on the cart here, is the Penobscot blend, which helps inoculate the roots. So the mycelium in the soil, that's another good reason why you want to build with compost, is the surface area of the roots can dramatically increase its surface area by the benefits of beneficial mycelium. So fungus in the ground will actually help the relationship of the roots in the soil and help the tree grow a lot better. So that's the other thing, is if you're mulching with hardwood chips, that also promotes a fungal environment that's going to promote root growth. So if you have a choice of hardwood chips, a lot of times if you flag the folks down that are doing work along the power lines, they'll have a mix of hardwood and softwood, which is great, and those larger chips are good, and we'll do that here too. So cardboard, compost, and wood chips is a really good way to just keep building your soil. Cool. And then the other thing we've got here is we've got some rodent protection, and that's something that we'll put on and off throughout the season. This is really important to prevent your trees from getting girdled. So this is something that we've lost the most trees from rodents girdling the base. The living part of the tree, as we'll talk about when we graft, is the cambium, which is the outer layer of the tree. So if a rodent were to just eat just the outer bit of the tree all the way around, it's going to die. So we prevent that. This is just fiberglass screen, so we get a huge rolls of it and cut it up because we have a lot of trees to do. And then tie it with twine. It looks like the twine is so biodegradable that it's already biodegraded. So
one of the voles are learning to untie it. Yeah, I mean, I cannot stress how important the girdle guard is, because especially bearing it down low, all it takes is 1 year of forgetting, which I've done before, and the voles will absolutely get to it, and they will take down a tree this size, and especially a smaller tree that's 1 or 2 years old. It's really frustrating because you graft it, you get it planted, everything's going well, and then you just, in the spring, you come out and it's girdled and it's ruined. So definitely a disappointment. Another type of guard to definitely consider on a smaller tree is a 5 to 6 foot high welded wire fence around it that is staked into the ground with wooden, like, road stakes. You can buy that sort of thing at Tractor Supply, and that's really important to keep. I think that the most dangerous type of deer injury is not deer walking up and nibbling off of this tree. It's a tree that's 5 or 6 feet high and small, and the deer grabs the top of it and bends it down and snaps it. And a couple years ago, I had the guards, but I was a little bit cheap with them and didn't make them big enough. So the deer were stretching their necks over it, grabbing onto the top leader, bending and snapping, and I lost 4 out of 16 3 or 4 year old trees, which is a major disappointment. And then sometimes there's things you just can't do anything about, like porcupines climbing up and down and then just going up to the top of a small tree and riding it down and breaking it. So sometimes nature just says, this tree is not going to happen, but you can definitely save yourself some time. It's crucial to get your tree to this 6 or 7 year old stage where you can kind of pull the guard off, leave the girdle guard, and just kind of have confidence that you've made it through the real hurdle of that immature tree getting bent and snapped and deer damaged.
My observation is voles are on the ascendant.
Yeah.
I mowed my field last October and they look like mice, but you know, they're field mice essentially. They're fat and they're hungry.
And they can do damage under the snow. So sometimes you'll have, you know, that 1 inch buffer between the snow and the actual ground. That's right where your most delicate part of your tree is. So I like to make sure that those guards, which need routine maintenance, as Richard just observed, there's no twine on there and it's probably not in great shape. That needs to get pulled down, almost buried, and maybe mulched around the outside. And then another thing to be really careful about, especially if you have folks with 0-turn mowers, if you have a landscaping crew that comes to your house, that guard also keeps them away from it, because everyone likes to do a great job and get that mower really close. And I lose probably 2 to 3 fruit trees a year just from people swinging on the 0-turn, and that blade or that guard on the mower hits that cambium layer just the way that a vole would girdle it, and that's really just like creating a big wound in the tree's vascular system. So it's not able to transport that fluid up and down, and it desiccates it very quickly.
Yeah. And so that's another reason to mulch around the base solidly, so that nobody's tempted to go in there with a weed whacker or anything. It looks like there's a little bit of damage here, but it should be okay. And then also one thing you can do is remove this in the spring, because the voles are, as Tom was saying, the voles come in more in the winter time in the snow. So you can remove this in the spring, and sometimes I like to paint the bases of the trees with like white interior latex paint. There's also Fedco Trees has a really good recipe for milk and lime, combination of a few different things for painting the bases of the tree if you don't want to use a synthetic product. But you can mix the interior white latex paint with up to 50% water. And what that does is it keeps apple borers. So borers are another big problem for young trees. They'll get in here. You'll notice like frass at the bottom of the tree if you have borers, and they can really just affect the health of the tree. And if you have trees that just don't seem to want to grow, a lot of times it's borers. Kids love painting the bases of the trees. I think it might give it a tiny bit of resistance to the rodents, but obviously not full. I think they'll still go through the paint if they're really
with sunburn. You know, we have an orchard with about 20 trees on the other side of the farm, and it's on a hill that slopes down, and it has perfect southeast exposure. But here in our microclimate on the coast of Maine, we don't get a big snowpack, or at least we haven't the last couple of years. It's usually a thin, icy layer that's right at the base of the tree, and that strong sun that's low angle in the wintertime can reflect off of that white, icy snow and hit the tree. You can actually get sunburn injury. So if you paint the bottom of that tree, it's another additional benefit so that the light can refract away from it or off the tree.
Yep.
Are you gonna try to control the height measure by the power line at all? Or?
Yeah, so that's something to consider, and probably should have been considered years ago. So something about.
How would you do it?
So again, with controlling with how it's grown, you can actually kind of aim which direction the tree is growing. So as I was saying, with 1-year-old growth, it promotes growth if you cut into 1-year-old on apple trees. And actually, the more you cut into the 1-year-old, surprisingly, the more it promotes growth. So you can actually figure out a bud that's like pointing in the direction you want it to grow in. And you can cut just above that, and it will send it off. It might want to go straight eventually. You can also make your own little ornaments, if you will. If you use like a 4-inch pot or something, and you fill it with concrete, and you put string in there to make like a little heavy ornament. If you're able to keep this tree like this for a few months, it'll just grow that way, and it'll be solid like that. So you might have also seen like people use spacers to shape the tree. So you can get something with like a wedge that pushes it like this, because actually you want branches to be kind of coming straight out, ideally. So you really want those to flatten out. This could be down here, so you could put a weight here. So similarly, you could do that as you get up closer to the power line.
Obviously easier when it's this tall and there's less buds to aim.
Richard, how did you decide for that to be the central leader on that side? What did you see about that made you think?
Well, yeah, whatever kind of looks like it's going to be most vertical growing and the highest. So you can see it's already the tallest. So there's some apical dominance that it has. So it being the furthest towards the top, there's already some hormones going to that tree called auxin that would promote it to grow and take off as the leader. But now with your power line thing, man, maybe we'll not cut this one out. So maybe we'll keep it open base and keep the height down. Since this is a focal tree on the farm, if we give this one a little bit more love, I think that'll be okay. And we'll make sure that we do the cardboard, compost, wood chips here. Yeah.
And so your compost, your mulching on the ground takes place when?
It could happen right now,
Yeah.
and actually, this should happen sooner than later, especially here, as the great groundskeepers, so that they're not tempted with a weed whacker. Because it looks like it might have gotten a visit from a weed whacker, but good thing that the guard is on here a little bit.
So, which brings up the question, as you build up, how high and where's the graft? I mean, that's grafted, I assume.
Yeah, so good. That's one thing that I did want to talk about. So on this tree, we'll just take this off. It needs to be redone anyway. It looks like, so it's been here a little bit. This one is harder to see. When we planted it, we planted the graft union just above the ground. So again, why we graft for apples is if you were to take a black Oxford seed out of a black Oxford apple and plant it in the ground, 9 times out of 10, you're gonna end up with a fruiting tree that's totally different than the black Oxford. So just like your genetics, some people look exactly like their parents, maybe 1 out of 10. Every now and then you might get a seedling that looks a lot like its parent, but it's all going to be different, and the inherent genetics that have been in apple trees for centuries are going to express themselves. So there's a couple of varieties that are more true to type. If you want to grow peaches from seed, that's fine, because there's less inherent diversity of genetics in them. So actually you can grow peaches from seed. We're growing a lot of plums from seed here at the farm, but you can notice the beach plums that we have at the hilltop, there's actually a lot of variation in them. And so we can actually, Tom works with some folks who are into genetics and all that. So we actually might help select the varieties that could become, so by selecting the seeds of a plum that's larger, these beach plums, you can actually start to create your own variety, if you will, or just like dogs came from wolves, these little dogs, they were wolves once. It's wild, but it's just a matter of generation after generation. If you're selecting for certain qualities that you want, eventually you're going to end up with little dogs and very big dogs from wolves. So similarly, why we graft is so that we can know that this is the black Oxford from the 1700s in Paris, Maine, because we keep doing what we're doing today, which is grafting. So you start with a rootstock, and you can grow your rootstock from seed. A lot of times the nurseries will root them out, so they'll kind of lay trees on their side, and they'll put up, they'll have roots that come into the ground, and they'll propagate it that way. There's a lot of different ways to get rootstock. You could start trees from seed and use that as your rootstock. The other neat thing is if you do start your own trees from seed, you might create a variety that nobody's ever seen before, and you can name it, and it might be great. So there is something to be said for growing trees from seed. and especially if you're into cider or making hard cider, you know, those bitter apples that a lot of times come out of just chance seedlings can be good for that. So there's something to be said for growing from seed, but the only way to get what you really want is grafting, and that's what we're going to do today. So I explain it to kids, it's like a mutant tree. You're taking 2 trees and you're making one. So it's this has the root qualities of the Antonovka, which is a standard size, so full size tree. So this is going to be a big tree, and so we're going to keep an eye on this power line over time. And so you can see how there's a bulge kind of down here. And you can actually even see here where the graft actually happened. There's still a wound. And so down here is the roots of the tree. It's a different tree. This is where it was grafted. And what that does, the rootstock will allow this to be a full-size tree. If we wanted this to be a small tree, we would have just put it on dwarfing rootstock. So the rootstock you choose is really important to the vigor of the tree and the size of the tree. Again, this tree still hasn't really made good fruit yet, right, Tom?
Not yet.
And standards does take a lot longer, but it also lives a lot longer. This could live a couple hundred years. The dwarfing rootstock will start producing fruit at a much younger age, as little as 5 years maybe, but also it lives a lot less, so maybe 40 years for a lot of these fully dwarfed trees, like Bud 9 or something. So, so that's a lot of information about this tree, the parent tree, and happy to answer questions before we get on making our own mutant trees. Yeah.
Richard, so are there certain microclimate conditions that favor a dwarf tree over a standard tree? Meaning, if you're going to plant in a windy area, or you're on the coast and you've got ocean sea breeze, does it make sense to try to plant, like, would a dwarf tree hold up better in a more adverse climate with higher winds, or
Probably less well.
less well?
So these trees are more rooted, it's a much better root structure. You know, the semi-dwarf is not as well rooted or anchored. A lot of times with fully dwarf trees, you need a trellis or you need support, stake them, because they're not well rooted. So if wind is a concern, then maybe not. But another thing you can do with dwarf apples, if you're really into it, is you can grow them on a trellis. So just like you grow grapes, you can grow fruit branches and train them along a trellis or a fence like this. It just requires a lot more work and time and energy, but if that's what you're into, then that's awesome. So there is something to be said for growing fruit on apples on a trellis. If you want, like, set it and forget it a little bit more, plant either semi-dwarf or standard. I also really like semi-dwarf. Like M111 is a good semi-dwarf variety that is well rooted, but it's kind of in between. It doesn't live as long as this guy, but it's also not going to get mammoth and out of control, and it will start fruiting at a younger age. So a lot of times at our school orchards we'll plant M111, which is a semi-dwarf variety. But yeah, good question.
And, you know, microclimate considerations like, do you have power lines above? You know, maybe semi-dwarf is the way to go. If you're running an orchard or you don't want to be up on ladders all the time, you might want to go with a dwarf or semi-dwarf rootstock. You know, I mean, you see a lot of the orchards these days, you know, for liability, they want people to be able to reach up and grab their apples. They don't want people up on ladders running around. So that's a consideration. And if you have a conservation easement where you can't be planting things that affect the viewshed, that's our case, and that's why we've gone with semi-dwarf rootstock up in the fruit and vegetable plot where we're about to head up to.
Exactly. Great. Any other questions before we...
Just to get back to the altitude
Yep.
question, I think it's clear you're not supposed to cover the graft.
Right.
Okay.
Well, that's actually... So some people, they do plant the graft below the union, because what can happen is at the first years you're using the rootstock and you actually get some of the qualities of the more dwarfing rootstock. but eventually the upper part, which is probably standard, will start to send roots in too, and so then you end up with a longer lived tree, but with some of the early qualities of the younger rootstock. So some people do bury the graft, but then it is going to revert back to standard rootstock eventually. But so this one we planted just, we kept the graft above the soil level.
And always have it facing north, having
Yeah.
your actual graft wound so it's not getting direct sun.
And you can actually see where the wound is here. So maybe when we're done here, you can see where this wound happened. And we did face it to the north, so we actually did our job.
Unless you have a very strong seasonal north wind, then you might want to orient it northwest just so that your freshly grafted tree isn't constantly rocking with the wind, as the, having that wound acting like a little miniature hinge almost. So another consideration.
Yeah.
You still want to have it pointed south-southeast, right in the sun.
Yeah, and so that's just so that the wound can, and this one's pretty much all the way healed over, and you just don't want the sun beating down on it if it were to be facing south.
Cool. Well, how do folks feel about loading up on the wagon? Or you can walk. It's about a 3.5 minute walk up to that green shed up on top of the hill. Or if you feel comfortable hopping on the wagon with the rest of our participants here, we will head up and we can